Welcome back, everyone, to the Ask Dr. Be Good show, the show where we bring you the interesting, the current things going on in public education. Today, we have on a special guest. He's been on before, and the topics are similar, but this is even more current. We have on Clarence Glover, aka Professor Freedom, on today, and we're going to be talking about not only the social unrest, but what we can do moving forward. But before we get started, Clarence, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? You have a very unique one, and what you're bringing to our social justice table today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Good. I'm certainly glad to be with you today, and hello to the audience. Well, I grew up in Louisiana, of course, and went to Grambling State University and then to Southern Methodist University here in Dallas. I majored in history. And coming to Perkins School of Theology, I came here with a focus on African American religion and culture. While there, I started working at El Centro and went to the Martin Luther King Community Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where I began working with Mrs. King, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, Mrs. Rosie Parks, and other members of the movement, Mr. John Lewis. So I worked there for a number of years, and I became a member of the SMU staff, Director of Multicultural Affairs, and also an adjunct professor of African American Studies. Stayed there for 15 years, and then at BISD as assistant to the general superintendent for intercultural relations and multicultural education. So I've spent over 30-something years in the area of multicultural education in early years, starting in the early 80s.
Okay. And so you were recently featured, matter of fact, in D Magazine, online D Magazine article. And we have a picture of you there with Black Lives Matters. It's neat that they featured you. I guess they called you an elder in the movement.
Yes.
So we'll take that as a
I was
compliment, right?
Yeah, with the little gray that's on now, I can't get rid of it. I'm not dying, I guess. But there was a young man by the name of Miles, who was there, a young European American male who had been seeing me at different rallies. I would go and stand afar. I would not get in the crowd, but I would watch the young people as they would move around. I know many of the organizers of the movement. And so he watched me, and the day we were at City Hall, he came up to me and to interview me. I didn't realize he was actually going to publish something. He took a picture, and so later someone called me and said that I was in the magazine. And so he's a 17-year-old young man who I think will be a great part of this history because he's chronicling the movement here in Dallas. And so that's how the story was placed in the magazine.
Well, that good work is recognized there. So that was neat that happened by a 17-year-old who's going to amount to something. We already know.
That's correct. That's correct. And that's what was quite interesting because we have all of these individuals of all cultures. And it happened in the 60s as well. We had a lot of photographers and people who took pictures, both African American and European American, who chronicled the history. So I was glad to be a part of his life journey. And there were many individuals who asked him questions, and I was sharing with them at that time some of my concerns about the protests, about the fact that even those of us who are over 60 were not there, as opposed to in the 70s and 80s and the 60s, where the elders were with the movement. So there's an absence of eldership and guidance and wisdom in this time, so because of the pandemic and COVID-19.
So this social unrest has led you to want to create a new movement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, and Dr. Good, I didn't think I would be here. I've been enjoying Legacy, of course, as you know, and Professor Freedom has been enjoying the work with young people as well as teachers and understanding this new multicultural reality in our country. As I've said with you before, America is an experiment, and we're still in the process. But I think these incidents, most recently with Mr. Floyd and others, and police departments across the nation have thrust us into a very deep place in terms of Americans' future. I could not sit back because even during the COVID moments, even well, in Louisiana, when Louisiana was hit very hard, I lost a number of friends, neighbors, classmates during that time, and I just felt helpless. And so then early on, I began working with the mask campaign through my church, and we started doing masks, etc. These are the things that we could do. And then later on, as the protest grew with Mr. Floyd's death, I again could not just sit back and twiddle my thumbs. And so by being out there, but also beginning to work on a movement, as Mrs. King and others taught us, what Dr. King teaches us through his writings, is that good people must act during bad times. And so I had to do something. So I developed what is called the New America Movement.
Hmm.
And the New America Movement has a synopsis of my work over some 30 years. One race, different cultures, which suggests that we're not different races. Even the language of race relations is not appropriate. If we keep using race relations, we're implying a caste system from top down, white to black, superior and inferior. Races of people is not scientifically factual. It is a negative social construct, but we are one human race of different cultures. So as we move toward this new generation of liberty and justice for all, as you see on the flyer, to become a part of the new movement and to begin to focus on that concept of one human race. And as I said at the bottom here, to understand human equality, not racial equality, because again, that's erroneous. Racial equality cannot exist because we're not different races, but human equality can. But we can explore issues of racism, which has been the abuse of the term race over a number of years. And that's why one of the books that I'll be offering during this time and suggesting for reading is Lies My Teacher Told Me. And this book is by Dr. James Lowen. It was written back in the 1990s. He was a professor at Tougaloo in Mississippi and then went on to the University of Vermont. And as a European American scholar, he's read just many, many textbooks and has processed them and written a book that talks about the lies in America. And so we are now at a point where the new America must now look at these lies, these myths that have been told about America, and to replace them with truth so that we can build our nation upon truth and not mythology or the lies of the past.
So, can you give us some examples of some lies that were taught in the classroom?
Oh, certainly, certainly. One of the things, if you look at the flyer again, one of the things that you see on the flyer is the picture of the Statue of Liberty. And for many years, we have thought that the Statue of Liberty was given to us, and it represents an immigrant movement. For most of us, given your tired, your poor, your hollow masses yearning to be free. And this is what we associate the Statue of Liberty with. Well, the Statue of Liberty was actually a gift from France, made through the inspiration of a professor by the name of Professor Lavoisier in Versailles, France, at a dinner party where they were discussing. He was an abolitionist, and the Civil War was over, and he was very proud that the emancipation had taken place. What they did then was to construct this statue after monuments in Egypt, and at the bottom of the feet of the Statue of Liberty are shackles, and they're open. They were to be in the arm earlier, but they would not receive them in the arm, so they placed them at her feet, the Statue of Liberty's feet. And so that's where they are to this day. And so I've written a poem to reflect that rather than the 1886 poem. And so it speaks to that. It's called Lady Liberty's Voice. And so it helps to reconstruct. And those are the three elements of the New American movement. They're reconstruction, reevaluation, and redirection. They complement the three R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, which are the technical tools of learning. Through reconstruction, we go back to the past and reconstruct information, knowledge that we've not known. Then with reevaluation, we engage in our emotions, feelings, and attitudes about this new knowledge. And in redirection, we plan and direct ourselves into a new future with this new knowledge that we've gained from the Reconstruction reevaluation process.
So, when you say Reconstruction, you're not talking about the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War, right? You're talking about
No, we're
Reconstruction
talking about the
now.
stage here in the plan. Of course, that's a period of stage that could be must be looked at because most people are not familiar with the 10-year period after the Civil War and the Radical Reconstruction period, where African American men in particular were political leaders across our nation. They did a number of things in Congress and state positions. And there's also, they had a great impact on public education because prior to that, education was primarily private, white, and male. And they were able to put in legislation to bring around public education for freed African men and women, boys and girls, and then also poor whites of a different class. So this is where we see the evolution of a public education system. But we see the end of Reconstruction with the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, who took the federal troops out of the South. His election was based upon being selected, not necessarily elected, but the compromise was is that if they pulled the federal troops out of the South, who were protecting the freed men and women, then he would be placed as president. And from that point on, from 1877, we saw 100 years of basically Jim Crow laws put into place until Dr. King later on mentioned in his speech that 100 years later, the Negro still is not free because of the Jim Crow laws. And during those laws, this is where we saw the rise of police and fugitive, what they call fugitive slave patrols, which became the police, all the rangers and so forth. And this is where the beginning of police and African American community relations began, which has been very negative over these years, even through my lifetime, growing up during Jim Crow. Uh, that's why we have these issues today because we have not helped people understand that there has never been a positive relationship in America between the African American community and the police department because of its origin.
So, there's an excellent article that I'll put the link in called Be Your Own Historian by teachingtolerance.org. And they refer to that period, that 10 years after Reconstruction, as interracial democracy that we had for that period and that we really need to strive to get back to, right? We had 2,000 African Americans in local and state government jobs and political jobs, political positions. And that's when, unfortunately, the rise of the KKK and white supremacy happened to the point where
That's correct.
it overrode all the forward progressive happenings during.
Well, back during that time, the KKK was associated with the political leaders. As I said, Rutherford B. Hayes and others and other individuals were part of many different groups that were to undermine the life of freed African men and women. They were not silent. They were not quiet about their associations. And so we see the end of the Reconstruction period, which could have been a glorious period of developing this nation as we know it, as we would have known it then. But at that time, the movie Birth of a Nation. I'm sorry, not Gone. That's another. Birth of a Nation came out, and it demonized the Radical Reconstruction period, showing African American men as being shiftless, lazy, eating chicken bones, throwing chicken bones in Congress, etc. Very demeaning. But it also showed the ultimate view that freed African men would ultimately be attacking the symbol of white purity in the South, and that would be a white female. So you have the image of Gus, a white man who's painted his face black, and the young woman who ultimately jumped from a cliff and then kills herself, and then the Klan comes after this gentleman and his attempt to arrest him. But that became the whole issue of lynchings, and so that's when lynchings began because we did not see as many lynchings during slavery because you did not kill because Africans we were chattel property, so we were like cows and mules and so forth. So you protected, you kept your labor healthy as best you could. But after the Civil War, then we began to see the onslaught of slavery, of lynchings and other things that began to actually attack the lives of African men and women.
So you asked me what my ahas were from this article. Another aha was the fact that the Holocaust has a huge national monument in Washington, D.C., and it was just recently, and it's been there for years, but it was just recently that we have an African American national monument in Washington, D.C., and the Holocaust didn't even happen here, right?
Right. Well, we have the
Huge,
museum. We have
huge,
the museum.
huge aha for me though, to say, wait a
Yes.
minute.
We
You know, we're celebrating something that didn't happen here. It was important, yes, but we didn't celebrate the abolition of slavery in a national way like we have the Holocaust, and that was yikes. You know, and that
yes.
all over the South, and of course, um, you have all these statutes of Confederate soldiers and generals and so forth, but no statutes of Nat Turner and other abolitionists who made such a huge difference. And all of that spoke to me. And I used this with other white people to say, guys, here's what some of the stuff we're missing that we didn't understand.
Well, I think that we still are struggling with the meaning of the Civil War. A nation that became divided, two countries, the Union and the Confederacy. Certainly, the bloodiest war on our domestic soil. We, we're dealing with the fact that the South lost, the Confederacy, as we say, lost to the Union. And these were families, these were many times relatives, etc., who knew each other. These were business associates. And so white America has been struggling with that for a number of years because, of course, the North had slavery as well from 1619 through 1776 because it was Africans who built America. They built Monticello, they built Mount Vernon, they built the Capitol, they built White House, they raised the children, they cooked the food. So the Africans who were enslaved were the principal workers who built early America. And then we have the southern cotton industry, which gave rise, and then the conflict between the North. So you had these conflicts going on, and so then when the South succeeded from the Union to preserve slavery and way of life, later on to be defeated by the Union, that has not yet been reconciled. So as we see the Sherman coming down through Atlanta and so forth, burning many of the plantation homes, we see those individuals coming to Dallas, particularly into Texas, the Carews, the Millers, plantation owners, the Miller families, and they come here. So we haven't reconciled that. So you see the whole idea of when I came to Dallas, they were having the old South balls. They were having the South would rise again. And so we have all these things. So when you have a country that's been defeated, but yet this nation still allows the defeated country to put up monuments, that says something about the complicity of the nation and what it thinks about those monuments over in the past years, because they were put up in the 1930s and 40s as acts of intimidation during the Jim Crow period. And so now that we're at this point of our, as I say, new America, it is a time to have the deep conversations about who we will be as a nation as we move forward.
So how does that happen? What has to happen now, moving forward?
Again, I think the conversations both among us as African Americans, because as I look every day now as an African American, and me, my friends and colleagues and family members, we wake up and we are devastated. Our children are there, our grandchildren, because we are seeing an attack, not just with Mr. Floyd but and the others. We're seeing a young lady the other day who was doused with lighter fluid and set on fire. We're seeing a man who's walking in the park doing nothing but watching birds, and he's a lady calls the police on him. We're seeing athletes and other people who are sitting in restaurants and being escorted out because they're having conversations. We're seeing young people go to Sonics here in Dallas and being told to leave. This is how we wake up every morning as African Americans. So our reality is that that's the brokenness of America. But I use the terminology of the bat, those who have broken the legs of African Americans, the bat. Why are we talking about the bat? And where's the bat? And how can we keep people from breaking the legs of African American culture? Slavery is a two-way system, shackles and keys. Those of us who were in shackles, our ancestors, had a direct relationship to those who had the keys to open up those shackles. So as Dr. King said it, he said the civil rights movement was designed to save the black man's body and the white man's soul. So just as we have issues of gender differences between men and women, and we've seen those dialogues go on, and certainly because white women and white men are having those dialogues at home, we don't have the opportunity to have deep conversations as African Americans and European Americans. And so we must take these conversations deeper. They must not simply be guided. There's a book called White Fragility. It talks about the difficulty of whites with racism, but it has more to do with how frail, how delicate that is. And but with Mr. Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence's book, it's a very hard book. It's a very direct book. And so, if we speak about the truths of America, then as we go forward, we must let these truths guide us, so that the lies and the myths, and ultimately, we must begin to recognize that the issue is about humanity. Can white America look at Black America and people of color as human beings, as a shared human family? Uh, that we are one biological family, which research suggests and shows now, as Perot Museum had, we are all from the cradle of civilization of humanity in Africa, and we migrated out, and migration, isolation, and how we evolved in our physical features and our mentalities. And now here we are in America, this experiment uh, of all of us here together.
So I want you to know that we've taken this very, very seriously at Legacy. And we've had several conversations with the curriculum team and the campus leadership. And we're studying a different article that talks about how to train teachers to be more wary of the materials that they're presenting and how to make sure that they are presenting a whole view versus an European-centric, male-centric perspective. Because the materials
Exactly.
from the old days, that's the perspective. And
Exactly.
so,
This is what we dealt with in the,
go ahead.
we dealt with this in the early 80s. Again, when I was at DISD, SMU and DISD, when I started educating one race, many cultures concept. And I now use different races because we are different. We're not just many, but we are different. And those differences are not necessarily divisive, they're just different. So when you look at the curriculum and you're talking about the academic canon, you must establish, from that point, how do you change this academic canon, which has been built around what is called a Teutonic origin theory from a Germanic male perspective? The mythology is within it. We say myths, the cultural myths that are within books, even the geographical myths that we have. When I train teachers, as I've done here at Legacy, I would ask the question, how many continents are there? And we always say seven. We name the continents. Then once we name the continent, I say, what's the definition of a continent? A large land mass surrounded by water. We've done that for years. And then I ask educators and teachers, look at Europe. Is Europe surrounded by water? Everyone looks at the map of the globe and they pause. And for the first time, they realize that Europe is not a large land mass surrounded by water. And they struggle with that. Well, this is a reconstruction process. This is a reconstruction uh, process thing that we do, one of many. And we begin to, how is Europe a continent then? Because that has been the dominant perspective. And we now see it as more Asia-Euro or Euro-Asia. But if we begin that as a perspective, then you're starting there with called a geographic or direct reconstruction of our geographic understanding of the world. And so that's where teachers must begin and begin to look at how they use materials or how they look at the beginning of world civilization. How do we go into Africa? Do we look at Shanghai, Mali, Ghana, Timbuktu? Do we go back to Egypt, which is in Africa? How do we unpack all of this? And that's where we had to have deep conversations.
Yeah, we definitely, we have to start with our adults, and of course, everything, everything that impacts kids negatively or positively has to do with the adults around them. But, I'm a
That's
firm
correct.
believer in everything that causes a child to behave oftentimes in a not positive way is because of an adult or adults around them, whether parent, bad uncle, teachers, but It's the adults, and in this case, very definitely the adults have to do some changing of their understanding of how to present materials to a diverse group of kids by making sure that they feel valued through the story, through the narrative. And so we're very definitely putting that on our agenda for when we come back from break and we start planning projects for next year. It's just a necessary work. It just cannot not happen anymore.
Well, there are two things is that, as I've said back when I was training police department here in Dallas back in the 80s, I made a statement then. I said that the most oppressed person in the 21st century would be the white male. And I said that because if you don't focus and have concern about white men who of European descent who are going through this change process of the transition from a monoculture to a multicultural world, then they will react very negatively. We have not done a good job of that, and we must do that. We must be concerned about their emotions. We must be concerned about, and this is what Dr. King was telling us about. We must not hate them any more than they should hate us. But I say we should hate hate and not people. We should be prejudiced against prejudice and not people. But we should work to help them understand the transition that must take place and work along with it, aside them. And then we also must recognize, which is another issue facing us, that 2020 is a pivotal point in terms of the census where white people in America have now reached a point where they will be becoming a minority in terms of number. When we look at the census and we see certainly Hispanics and the DACs, certainly African Americans, but particularly Hispanics, because most Hispanics, when they are born in this country, they're identified as white, and then many of them sign on their census that they're white, but they in reality are part of the community of color, the mestizo. And so we see them together, even in the movements together, because they are treated in a minority status role. So as we move forward and we began to see African Americans, Hispanics, even I would say African Americans, because we all share a Moreno bloodline, if you will, with Asians and Native American people, indigenous people, along with European Americans. As we build this new America, we have to begin to put new definitions to who we are. And ultimately, as I've always said in the past, is that those of us who might not be able to embrace the three L's as we could did in the 60s, it could have in the 60s, but today we have the three L's I call to learn as much as you can about someone, to choose to live wherever you desire, and then the ultimate is to love whomever you wish. And that's the generation that we are raising today, for them to learn as much as they can about others and to live wherever they may choose to live. And because they are able to come together as human beings to love whomever they wish, and that will create a new America that none of us have ever seen before.
Well, from your lips to God's ear. And time is never our friend, and we're at the end of our time. But thank you, Clarence, for being on. I know this is not the end of the conversation between you, me, and
Thank you
the
so much, Dr.
school.
Good, for allowing it to take
And
place.
oh yeah, it's just
And for your leadership over the years, and that's important because it takes the leadership. That's where it begins. And I've always said that philosophy, policies, and practices. If the leaders of school districts and corporations and religious organizations do not start there, I want to commend you. Thank you for the tough work you do to
well,
bring us into this reality.
it's work that has to be done. It's necessary. It's good for our kids. It's good for our families, and so that's why we do it. So thank you for being on. I'm sure it's not the last time. I'm sure we'll see you again
Thank you.
soon.
Thank you. Welcome to the new America.
Amen.
For more information on Legacy Preparatory Charter Schools, visit our website, legacypca.com, or call 469-249-1099. And remember to like us on Facebook, where we stream live weekly Tuesdays at 3 p.m.